Alexa Carter, and welcome to World History Review. Today's agenda includes reviewing World War I. Let's hear more about this from military expert Officer Charlie Parks.
The bedrock cause of this war was when Archduke of Austria-Hungary Franz Ferdinand was shot by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip as the Archduke visited Sarajevo. The tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia rose significantly. Also, when Britain saw Germany as a threat because Germany's industrial output had surpassed Britain and Germany built a powerful navy, this was a dangerous sign of war.
What are some other signs of war we can look for out in the future?
As I said, this rivalry has been a major conflict that's also drawing in allies, which is a sign of war brewing. Alliances hope to keep peace and prevent attacks, but they just bring in countries that don't have a cause in this war. The only reason that they're participating is because of a mutual defense agreement. Imperialism is an act of countries in rivalry for power across the world, which also leads to war. Militaries build up because of imperialism, and more wars require more men. Many people say having a big military starts war, but I think people's decisions start war. Nationalism causes strong ties between people and their country. They fight for their independence, which is also another sign of war.
Going back to Austria-Hungary, who declared war first?
Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia supported Austria-Hungary. Germany, also an Austria-Hungary ally, saw Russia as a threat. Therefore, Germany declared war on Russia and its ally, France. It was a pure chaos. Germany was also at a severe disadvantage geography-wise because it was located right between Russia and France, who were allies.
Germany used the sleeping plan that called for attacking France first, and then turning around to fight Russia. Germany saw Russia's size as an advantage for them in this particular plan. The plan also required Germany to go through the neutral Belgium to get to France. Because Belgium is on a flat plain, it was easier for the military to move fast. This plan failed because it went slower than planned, so Russia attacked from the east. The Russian attack failed to defeat the Germans, but it stopped the Germans from defeating the French. Germany's attack on Belgium caused the Britons to declare war on Germany. The Central Powers were Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Allied powers were Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia.
Exactly. The whole World War has cost the world 70 million lives. 50 million alone are from Russia. Military deaths exceeded 8 million, and 20 million soldiers were wounded as a cause. When soldiers were sent back home, they were carrying diseases, and it spread, resulting in almost 50 million deaths.
Why was the World War such a big deal, and what made it a world war?
World War I will create the modern world. The propaganda and political cartoons that came with the war lead to future uses of the radio and film to create mass culture. Economically, many countries were leading to a depression due to the cost of the war and peace treaty agreements. Political turmoil arose and how to manage mass societies. The three government ideas were liberal, democratic, authoritarian, and anti-colonial. It was a true world war because literally the whole world was involved in one way or another. The Ottomans got in on action when they accused the Armenians of working with the Russians against them. Fighting was done in Africa and Asia. Countries were dragged in men from colonies they held, so colonies revolted for independence as well.
Can we hear some of the fighting techniques and new weapons used based on your military expertise?
Yes, trench warfare was big during World War I. It's when you fight from and live in trenches. They're built in zigzag patterns with multiple levels that soldiers rotated between. Their raids were usually done at night. This was very hopeless because there was much death and not much movement. Living conditions were hard to cope with because it was tough to sleep and cold and wet. There were rats, dead bodies, and a common disease called trench foot. Countries needed new technology to penetrate trenches. Rapid fire machine guns, aircrafts and airplanes for scouting, zeppelins, tanks, explosive artillery, and poison gas were all used for effective fighting.
What exactly is total war?
Total war is committing all of society's resources to war. This was necessary because it was so deadlocked. The three major changes were government actions, adaptation of industry and agriculture, and a change in culture. Conservation laws were put in place and many industries fell under government control. Culturally, there were many men drafted into these wars. Women took over male occupations. Shortages at home caused riots of citizens demanding more from the government.
How did the war end, and what were the peace negotiations afterward?
Russia left the war early, and so the Eastern Front was taken down. Germany transferred troops to the Western Front, and German offensive reached within 40 miles of Paris, but it failed. Germany collapsed soon after when the armistice happened. Allies broke through the fortifications of the Hindenburg Line, and the Germans agreed to armistice. Other Central Powers were already admitted defeat, so the war was officially over because there was no common enemy anymore. The Allies all wanted something different after that. The Treaty of Versailles laid out the terms, which included changing the German government to democracy, German war reparations of $56 billion, German military cut short, and independent Poland. Germany split into 7 pieces, and its colonies were given to other world powers. The Ottoman Empire was disbanded as well. Austria and Hungary became 2 different countries, and many new countries arose in Europe. The League of Nations was also created, but Germany and the USA didn't join.
You mentioned Russia leaving the war early. Can you touch base on what exactly was happening in Russia during the war?
Well, Tsar Nicholas entered the war on the Allied side to relieve pressures on Russian government. Their army alone consisted of 6 million men. Though coming into the war, it seems like they were doing well for themselves, they faced many difficulties, like finding supplies for the war and for their ill-prepared military. Because transportation didn't allow for quick movement, there were millions of casualties early in the war. Due to the war going downhill, the Tsar decided to personally come onto the battlefield and lead his forces. This was a bad idea, as Russia slowly lost faith in him. Conditions worsened when there were food shortages and the government collapsed. The Tsar ended up abdicated and leaving them with a provisional government led by Kerensky, but later they changed it to a dictatorship by Lenin. Trotsky negotiations, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Central Powers was what got them out of the war. After Lenin's death, Stalin took over and Russia became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Though it was called Republic, it was actually dominated by communism.
Time here. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that summarized World War I for you. Emma Cole, a traveling journalist who wrote her first book very recently, is here today to discuss her vivid descriptions of Japan as it opens up to the world. So I figured we would start with the rise of Japan, seeing as how it's the first thing you wrote about in your book. So tell me, Miss Cole, how did Japan rise?
Well, it started with the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration started in 1853 when the Japanese began to be forced to engage with the world. The West forced Japan to open its port and limit tariffs. This process took place until 1968. In 1968, reformers overthrew Tokugawa shogunate, the last form of feudal military government in Japan. The reformers promised greatness to Japan, and to ensure that greatness would come, they sent observers to study the West. They also founded schools and strengthened the army.
Japan rebuilt itself economically during the Restoration.
It rebuilt its infrastructure by building railroads, laying telegraph lines, and founded a postal system. Zaibetsu, a Japanese term referring to the industrial and financial businesses conglomerates, were encouraged throughout the country.
Did the economy of Japan strengthen through these processes?
Yes, along with the military.
So how successful was the Restoration?
Japan became a major military power, defeating the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan became the biggest power in Asia and a world power. Japan also thrived economically, with the GNP rising 40% during World War I. Japan continues to thrive until they reach the 20s, where they hit a few bumps in the road, economically, socially, and governmentally.
What kind of bumps were in the road, and where was the road leading to?
Economically, Japan had been thriving, but then exports tripled between 1913 and 1929. Japanese exports dropped in value by 50%. The Depression hit and the U.S. and China imposed tariffs, and unemployment became a huge problem. When there is a huge unemployment rate, civil unrest grows. Socially and governmentally, the conservatives were having a hard time accepting the changes from the West, and many were unpleased with the democracy of the Restoration. Although the economy and the government were having troubles, the military just kept growing and strengthening. With the Great Depression and the economic crisis of 1927, the government seemed useless, so the military stepped in and tried to take control of the situation. To solidify its control over the government, the military used a tactic called Campaign of Terror against people who were not cooperating with the military's plans. They also used propaganda and placed military men in schools.
What was the purpose of putting military men in schools?
The purpose was simple. They wanted to ensure that the teachers were teaching the children exactly what the military wanted them to learn. They were placed there to make sure that the military's values and beliefs were the ones being forced upon the children.
So, over time, the military began to dominate the government, taking away any say they had in the country's affairs. An example of this would be the Manchuria incident, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. For those of you who don't know, the Manchurian incident in 1931 was when the Japanese military leaders wanted Manchuria for coal and iron for the Japanese industry. The Japanese army arranged a bombing of a Japanese-owned railroad in Manchuria and blamed the Chinese for it. China didn't do it, but Japan said otherwise, so they invaded. The civilians of Japan protested, but the military refused and invaded anyways.
How did this event lead to change in foreign relations?
Originally, Japan was in the League of Nations, but this event caused the League of Nations to condemn them, which led to Japan dropping out in 1933. In 1936, Japan signed an anti-Comintern pact with Nazi Germany, agreeing to stop communism. Italy later joins this pact, and they become known as the Axis powers.
Thank you for speaking to us about the rise of Japan. Donna Smith from the United States of America to talk about what it was like before and during the Great Depression. I understand after the First World War, the economy was booming. Could you talk about that? Start us off?
Oh, absolutely. After the war, I think I was about 23 years old, and let me tell you, it was a blast. Nearly everyone was employed, and the stock market was climbing steadily. Those were the days. The movies were innovative, and the music was outstanding and catchy. Everything was going great. I never expected it to end. I remember reading a Header magazine article in 1929 written by a man named John J. Raskob. The title was Everyone Gotta Be Rich.
By the end of the decade, called the Roaring Twenties, the U.S. economy began to crash. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Unfortunately, there were lots of problems with the stock markets that were really affecting the economy.
Like the distribution of this new wealth and the uses of credit?
Yes, the richest 1% of the world was earning 19% of the nation's income. Can you believe that? It was a disaster when people started reaching the limit of their credit cards and could no longer afford things, which caused the economy to suffer greatly.
That sounds awful. Could you explain what credit is?
Sure. Credit is an arrangement between a person and in a bank, in which the person borrows money from the bank and agrees to pay the money back later in time.
Do you believe the crash of the stock market led to the Great Depression?
In my opinion, yes. It was definitely the biggest factor. One of the worst days was Black Tuesday on October 29th, 1929.
What's Black Tuesday?
The darn investors sold 19 million shares. This not only ruined many investors, but the banks were in horrible financial trouble as well for lending money to these investors.
That's ridiculous. Now you said before the biggest factor. What other factors contributed to the depression?
When I remember, the industry began to slow down before the crash of the stock market. I was unemployed and it was tough.
It wasn't uncommon to be employed in the 30s. In fact, one out of every 4 people were unemployed.
Yes, my husband and I were in such poverty that we weren't able to buy much food or extra goods, just as the same as the other Americans. I can imagine that this damaged the industry greatly. Also, our President Hoover did nearly nothing to fight this depression. His advisors thought the Great Depression was a good adjustment to the previous roaring of the economy.
Did any government figure ever try to stop the depression from continuing?
Our president, Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1932, seemed to care much greater than Hoover. He created something called the New Deal,
What's the New Deal?
a program he made to fight the Great Depression. It gave jobs to the unemployed people like myself. It created order to protect the stock markets and the banking systems.
And this was a worldwide issue?
Yes, after the Depression began in the U.S., it spread throughout the world.
Thank you, Donna. It was nice talking to you about the tragic economic crash you had to live through. Next up, we have interviewed with Dr. Wahengu Pal Singh Sadehu. Dr. Sadehu has researched, written, and taught extensively on United Nations, peace operations, Southern Asia, arms control, and much more. So without further ado, I present Dr. Wahengu Pal Singh Sadehu.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Today we are going to talk about the interwar years and independence in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Let's start with India. How did the Indian nationalist and independence movement start?
British Raj had extolled virtues of parliamentary government for over a century, so the Indians had very little control in their own government. With their lack of ability to control their own government, they felt helpless. This sparked a feeling of nationalism inside of the people. They also felt that something needed to be done because of the Amritsar massacre. This occurred because the British passed laws to punish protesters. The British killed 379 and wounded at least 1,200.
And this massacre is what got Gandhi involved?
Yes, Gandhi, who at the time was a lawyer, stepped in and became the primary leader of India's independence movement, and also the creator of a nonviolent disobedience that would influence the world. Gandhi was driven by a truth force known as Satyagraha.
How did the Middle East change after World War II?
New countries were formed, including Turkey and Iran, from leaders being overthrown and empires being destroyed. Turkey came to be because the Ottoman Empire dissolved, and although the original plans were for countries surrounding it to receive its land, Kemal Mustafa fought these plans and created what he intended to be a secular government, ending Muslim influence.
After World War II, the Middle East was still full of conflict, including the Arab-Israeli conflict. Could you tell us about how that started and what was it all about?
The conflict started when the British supported the Arab nationalists. They supported them in a rebellion against the Ottomans in 1916, but the British supported the Jewish nationalists as well. Unfortunately, these two groups did and still do not mix, so when the British backed both of them, trying to help them reclaim the same homeland, they got angry and began to fight each other. The Arab nationalists and the Jewish nationalists both wanted to claim Palestine as their homeland. The Arab-Israeli conflict refers to the political tension and military conflicts between the Arab nationalists and the Jewish nationalists.
Why did the feeling of anti-colonial rise in Africa, and what did they do about it?
Hundreds of thousands served in the war, and tens of thousands died, and there was a great economic hardship in Africa. Yet Africa was receiving no benefits for their help to the motherlands during the war. They sacrificed their people to help win a war, and yet they were still colonies. With this being the case, protests started to happen. They were slow and there were small changes in Africa, but as they began to happen, big changes began to happen.
Thank you for your time and for informing us all about all of it. And now we have former President Dwight D. Eisenhower to give us some meaningful and insider information about World War II. Welcome, President.
Thank you for having me.
Since World War I was a world war and operating through total war, many people have varying experiences. Can you tell us a little about what it was like as a general in the Second World War, Mr. President?
Well, it was a struggle of a war, and I played a large part in the war in Africa as well as the one in Europe, but I did not have a common experience as a commander. Actually, I did not get to see some of the most gruesome parts of the war as many soldiers and civilians did. However, because I led the attack of Allied forces on D-Day and commanded, I really knew a lot of the happenings in the war as a whole.
Do you think any good came from the war?
Well, many countries struggled and are still struggling to make a comeback from this war due to its economic damages, not to mention the huge number of casualties and deaths that resulted from this worldwide conflict. But America did not have as many of the economic struggles of the other countries, mainly due to the fact that the war was not fought on U.S. ground. Also, the three-world order emerged, consisting of the First World, which is the U.S. and other capitalist and democratic countries, while the countries who became or remained communist or socialist are considered the Second World. And the Third World, made up of former colonies or the semi-colonized. But really, the only good I see coming of this tragic war is that hopefully it will never happen again.
Since you hope this will never happen again, what was done to avoid having such a devastating war, and what were the original causes to begin with?
The war was caused by a few different problems. Many of them were caused by World War I, mainly due to the Treaty of Versailles, which resulted in debatable borders, financial difficulties, and overall unrest because of the harshness of this treaty. But also, Japan and Germany were the main problems. Germany wanted Lebensraum, or living space, and both Japan and Germany believed in racial and cultural superiority, resulting in an imposition of a racial hierarchy and the use of conquest and forced labor in these countries.
The Germans and Japanese treated certain ethnic groups horribly, but when, in your opinion, did the war actually start?
Well, I think the war started when Hitler began violating the Treaty of Versailles, whether he was doing it secretly or publicly. As soon as he began to put the plan to build a Third Reich into motion and militarizing, it was the beginning of the war. Although no one took direct action at first, some may argue on this point and say that the war did not start until after Hitler annexed Austria or when the Axis began to form. But the definitive beginning of the war, in my opinion, is when the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was formed in 1939. This was when the British and French began thinking Hitler was getting out of control. But the actual World War started, arguably, in 1937 when Japan invades Manchuria. This is the point when Japan really gets involved and moves forward by moving forces to French Indochina to get resources such as rubber and oil, because the U.S. banned the sale of oil to Japan, which caused Pearl Harbor, which resulted in America joining the war as well.
Some information about the three dictators and the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes?
Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin are all examples of totalitarianism, which is where total power is held by the state, and this power is used to control all aspects of a citizen's life. All three of these dictatorships had a lot in common governmentally, culturally, and economically. The citizens of these struggling countries allowed this controlling form of government because totalitarian regimes promised to return order. And due to the Depression, many had lost faith in the liberal capitalist system. But these totalitarian governments did not get into power solely based on the people's approval. They also used mass mobilization and terror.
So now we got a pretty good view of the happenings in Europe, one of the four theaters. Can you tell us what was going on basically in the other fours?
I was in charge of the British and American troops in North Africa, which is where America really got involved in the war. I was opposing the Desert Fox, or Rommel, and our major successes were in the 40s. especially when we captured 250,000 Axis prisoners, which was a huge triumph for the Allies. Troop placement in North Africa causes us some problems, though, with the USSR. In the European theater, Stalin was taking huge hits with the Siege of Leningrad, Battle of Stalingrad, and Hitler's attacks on southern Russia. But in the Pacific, Japan was controlling the majority of the islands until their forces were weakened by the Battle of Midway, an island-hopping campaign by the U.S. While in the Atlantic, the main action was just the sinking of U-boats and the Axis forces trying to block the shipments from the U.S. to Europe.
Can you tell us more about the success in island hopping campaign towards the end of the war?
Well, after we had worked our way close enough to Japan, we were able to bomb Tokyo using 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs. Then the battles of Iwo Jima and the Battle of Okinawa were two successful battles for the U.S. But the biggest dilemma experienced in Japan was the use of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I was not part of the decision and at the time had no knowledge of the Manhattan Project. I was busy planning D-Day, where we successfully fought and retook Paris and most of France, and pushed through the German counterattack or the Battle of the Bulge.
Thank you for your time, Eisenhower.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into World History Review. Signing off, Alexa Carter. Stay classy, history students.